Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited. I was invited to join the Crafty Meraki design team for the next 6 months. So I'm excited to share one of their new lines. This one is called All My Love. It has a clear stamp set, a layering stencil set, and a gorgeous Better Press plate with some sentiments, as well as some coordinating dies. So I'll be using this collection for this video, and I'll be sharing another collection in my next Crafty Meraki video, which will be next week. Today I'm sharing some must-try coloring techniques. These are just some of my favorite ways to color in images. And I'm starting off by using that Better Press plate in my Glimmer system. I love the fact that Better Press plates can be used both in your Better Press as well as your Glimmer system. It gives them so much more versatility. I used some aura foil. This is a gorgeous gold foil that has a holographic shine, and I'm doing my hot foiling on Hammermill Cardstock. I also like to do my solid hot foiling at the same time because I have the system already hot and ready to go. So I'm using my solid hot foil plate with the remainder of the foil after doing my first foiling image. I put the pretty side of the foil facing the plate and then my Hammermill cardstock on top, and then the plates on top of that. Press the timer button, and once that timer button has gone solid and stopped blinking, I can put that through my Platinum 6 machine. You do need the Glimmer for the heat as well as a die cutting machine for the pressure. You can't do this type of foiling with just one or the other. You need both of them. So once I have my foiling done, I'm going to die cut my image. This die set coordinates with both the Better Press image as well as the stamp set, and then obviously the stencil set as well, because the stencil set can be used with both the Better Press or glimmered image, or it can be used with the stamped image. So I love the fact that they all coordinate and intermix together, so you can mix and match which works best for you and what you like to create. And because I like to do my solid hot foiling at the same time, I will sometimes use those pieces in the cards that I'm creating, or I'll save them for future projects. Sometimes I just use that solid hot foiled image to create a mat for my cards. Sometimes I will just use those pieces for die cutting other things for other projects. It really depends on the image. For this one, I did use my die to die cut the sentiment. I wasn't sure whether I was going to use the foiled image or the solid hot foiled image for my sentiment for my card, so I have both of them ready to go. I'm using the layering stencil to do the coloring in for this particular image, and that layering stencil makes it so quick and easy. I have my piece on my Altenew sticky mat to hold it in place, and that is also going to hold my stencils in place. You can see where it sticks to that mat and it keeps it nice and secure on there. For some of the pieces that I'm doing today, the pieces are a little bit bigger and the mat doesn't have enough surface with my stencils to hold it. And in those cases, I will either hold it down with my hands or I'll use some tape to tape it down. Once I have everything lined up, I can start doing my stenciling. The first color that I used was Spun Sugar Distress Ink. This one here is Kitsch Flamingo Distress Ink. The images or the stencils are very easy to line up with the images. And because I have my image done with gold foil, I can see it right through that stencil. And each one of those stencils is also numbered. You don't necessarily have to go in the numbered order, but it does give you an idea of which order they are kind of intended. But even if you go out of order, or you can even miss certain ones just to customize it. For my third layer here, I'm bringing in an interference ink. This one is Tropical Paradise. And if you've never used interference inks before, these ink pads have an interference property to them. So they have one color that shows up on white or light cardstock, and then they have a different color that shows up on black or dark cardstock. So you get different looks from that same pad depending on what you do with it. So here I'm just using the dye property to it, which is the pink color, but even that is going to have a little bit of the interference shimmer to it. So even though I'm using this on light cardstock, you're going to see that shimmer to it once you tilt it into the light, and it adds a really pretty element to different images. For my leaves and foliage, the first color I started with was Peeled or Bundled Sage. The second layer here I'm using is Peeled Paint. And when I'm doing my stenciling, I'm using some Spellbinder's large ink blending brushes here. You don't necessarily need to use the ones that are this large for it. Because these areas are smaller, you could definitely use smaller brushes. I like to concentrate and make my ink darker where my leaves go behind my flowers, giving them a natural shadow. For the leaves, I'm adding some Summer Garden Interference ink. So this is going to show up green because we're using a lighter background here, but the interference is a blue shimmer. So when you tilt these areas into the light, you'll see a little bit of a blue shimmer on them. So I like using them with different layers just to give it a little bit more variety. And then finally, my last layer here, I'm using some forest moss. Now I die cut my piece before stenciling it simply because I knew I was going to want this die cut to create the card that I was going to create, but you don't necessarily have to. You could just do your image and you could stencil it without die cutting it. So you have that option of leaving it whole or leaving it how you foiled it or better pressed it or die cutting it. Here's the finished image, and the video really doesn't show off that interference as well as it shows in real life. So you get some beautiful sparkle from there. For the rest of my card, I'm adding a few other Crafty Meraki dies. So I'm using the frame-worthy dies as well as the Speckled Canopy dies. The frame-worthy die here I'm using with some sage cardstock to create a frame for my card. And the Speckled Canopy die, I'm not actually going to die cut it. I'm going to emboss that die in order to create a textured background for my florals. So once I have my frame done here, I can put it to the side. And I love the fact that it has some stitching around it. It gives it so much more variety. For embossing my background here, I'm using the layers for embossing a die, and it shows right up on these plates. So I have my plate down, I have some Hammermill cardstock here, I put the rubber mat on and then the gray embossing pad. And here's that finished result. That rubber mat pushes that cardstock into the openings of that die set, and it's a great way to use your dies in a different way to get another use out of them. I love the fact that you can just emboss dies and it creates an embossed background, but it looks completely different than if we were to use an embossing folder. So I trimmed down that embossed piece to 5 inches by 3 3/4 inches, and then I took another piece of Hammermill cardstock and cut that to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. For that Hammermill cardstock piece, I'm using that Tropical Paradise Interference ink pad, and I'm just rubbing it along the edges. This way I'm going to have a mat around my piece that completely coordinates with my florals or with that interference ink in my florals. For my sage frame here, I'm using that Summer Garden pad, but I'm using an ink blending brush to just put some of the ink around the edges. I'm not looking to completely cover this piece here. If I wanted to completely cover it, I probably would have just cut it out of Hammermill cardstock and then been very heavy with that brush all over it to get that color all over it. I still want to see some of that sage, but I want to have that interference or that shimmer around the edges of my frame. So when I first started, I just wanted it around the outside of my frames, but once I lifted it up, I thought it would look a little bit better if I had some on the inside as well. Once again, I'm not trying to completely cover it. I want to have a little bit of variety, a little bit of visual texture by not completely covering. So I want to see some of that shimmer, but I also want to see some of the natural color of that cardstock come through. So with all of those pieces ready, we're ready to assemble our card. I have some nice thick cardstock here that I used to create my card base, and it's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. First, I glued down the mat that has that Tropical Paradise Interference ink around the outside edge, and I only put it around the outside edge because that's the only part that you're going to see on the card. There's no point in putting ink on the center when it's going to be completely covered. Then I glued down my embossed background die piece. I'm using some Barely Art glue to glue it down. It's a nice liquid glue. You don't need a whole lot. I have it in a fine line bottle, so I can use it for large pieces as well as small pieces, and I use it to glue pretty much all of my cards together. There's very few things that I don't use that glue for. Then I use that same glue for gluing down that frame, and then I'll use it for the floral image. Between gluing different pieces down, I do use a large acrylic block just to hold everything down flat. It frees up my hands for working with other things. And by using an acrylic block, I can easily lay something on top of there, see how it's going to look on my card, and know whether I'm going to like it or know whether I want to move the positioning or whatnot. And it was easy also to do that and then pick and choose which of the hugs sentiments I wanted to use on the card. I can put it right on there, see whether I want to use the foil piece or the negative foil piece. For my second card, I'm using that same Better Press plate, but I'm using it in my Better Press system, and I'm going to do my pressing on some porcelain Better Press cardstock with some black Better Press ink. However, when you're using a Better Press system, you don't necessarily have to use Better Press cardstock. You can use any cardstock that you want, and you can use a variety of different inks. So it's very versatile in that way. You can even use those interference pads on your plates on your Better Press system. I've done it many times, but I love the fact that you can get a lot of variety with this. You can use many different inks and many different cardstocks. The one thing about using different cardstocks though, if they're not as thick as the Better Press cardstock, you're not going to get that letterpress impression on there, which it just depends on the type of look that you're going for, whether you want that. I like it for some things, but for other things, that's not what I'm going for. I'm just looking for the image on there. Here I'm using the Better Press ink, which is a nice permanent black ink. Again, you can use any ink you want. You could even use some embossing ink and then use some embossing powder on your piece. And I do that quite regularly. It just depends on the look that you're wanting to create. So when I placed my pieces on my Better Press system for this image, I knew that I wanted to keep this image as is. I wasn't intending to die cut it. So when I placed my plates, I was paying attention to how they were placed within the Better Press base as well as my sentiments. And then now I can use the coordinating layer stencils to color in that piece. Now, the one thing that I am going to be more careful about, because this piece isn't die cut, anytime I'm using a larger ink blending brush that I might happen to get on my card background, I just have some scrap pieces of paper here. These are things that I've printed off that I either don't want or something happened with the printing. I typically will keep these pieces and use them to do my heat embossing with the embossing powder over, but it also works well for stenciling like this. This way I can make sure that I'm not getting any ink anywhere other than my image piece. And I'm using the same colors that I used for the last one. The only difference here is instead of having a foiled image, I have Better Pressed it on Better Press cardstock, but the colors themselves are the same. The other thing I'm changing up a little bit is I'm not necessarily doing my colors or my stencils in the same order as labeled right on the stencils. They are kind of a suggestion. So for this particular one, I want to add some layers that have some dark stenciling to them to make sure that when I use my interference pads, I am going to see both properties of that interference pad. I'm going to see the areas on the lighter colors or my lighter ink, and I'm also going to see the interference properties on that darker ink. So for that second stencil that I used some Hickory Smoke Distress ink to create some darker areas. Often I will also use Black Soot Distress ink and get more of a dramatic look to it. For this particular one, I chose the Hickory Smoke because it was going to be a little bit more subtle. I chose the third stencil over the second one because it's got some smaller areas. So when I use the second one here with that Tropical Paradise Interference ink, I'm going to be inking over some larger areas other than just where I put that hickory smoke. And then I'm going to be able to see both properties of that ink. So I'll see where that ink goes over top of the light pink that I've already stenciled. And I'm also going to see where it's going over that hickory smoke area. So I can get kind of 2 for 1 with this. And it creates such a fun and interesting look. Next, I went with stencil number 7, and I'm going to do the same thing with some of the leaves and the foliage areas. And it really doesn't matter which stencil you pick and choose for this, but I am choosing a piece or a stencil that has some smaller areas on it. So when I use a stencil that has some larger areas with that interference ink, I'm going to see both properties again with that greeny blue. So I chose that seventh stencil for putting that hickory smoke there. Once again, you could do Black Soot if you wanted it to be a little bit more dramatic. I wanted it to be a little bit more on the subtle side. Then I am putting the next stencil down, making sure to mask off any areas that I have, mainly because I'm using some larger Spellbinders brushes here. But like I said before, you could use some smaller brushes easily. I just happen to have them nearby ready to go. But because they are much larger, I want to make sure that I don't accidentally get ink where I don't want it to go. So here I did tape my stencil down to keep it in place, plus put some of that scrap paper around the outside edges. Next, I'm going to do another layer of those leaves, and I'm just using that same tape to tape these down. This is just some painter's tape, and I'll just reuse it several times. It works really well for securing that stencil down and making sure that it's not going to move and shift on me. For my next color here, I'm using some Peeled Paint Distress ink, and then I'm going to use that same ink blending brush to blend that out. And just like the first image, I'm trying to make sure that I have darker areas where my leaves go behind the flowers. That's where a natural shadow would occur, and it just gives you some visual dimension when you're doing your stenciling, when you're doing your coloring here. Now I am stenciling this image in because it's so easy. The stencils make it so easy to work and color in these images, but you could easily use markers to color them. You could use a Copic friendly ink and you could color them with Copic markers. You could do this on watercolor paper and watercolor, and I will do some watercoloring for my next card. But it gives you a lot of variety on the different ways you can color. But I always love the option of having stencils because it gives you a unique look that way as well. And I didn't do it for this one, but you could even use a glitter paste for one of the layers and add some glitter or shimmer that way. Once I have my image completely done, and the last color that I used there was that Summer Garden Interference ink, so you do get some of that shimmer on there. So I trimmed that piece down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. I have a mat here that I trimmed down to 5 3/8 inches by 4 1/8 inch. Now my image looks a little bit plain with that background. So to add a little bit of extra texture to it, I'm using those interference inks and I'm just smushing them on my glass surface here, adding a little bit of water, and then using a paintbrush to add splatters to my background. It just makes that background not quite so plain. That shimmer ink is still going to have a little bit, or that interference ink is going to have a little bit of that shimmer to it. So when you tilt it into the light, it's not only going to coordinate with the colors in the image, but you're also going to have that shimmer very subtly on those splatters as well. As well as that Tropical Paradise one, I also did the Summer Garden one to coordinate with the greens in the card. And now I'm ready to glue everything together. I'm using that same Barely Art glue, putting all the layers on my card base. Now for this particular one, I made my mats different size than my last card, but you could easily do the same size mats if you wanted to. I wanted to show a little bit of variety here. So this particular one, because they're cut a little bit bigger, you're going to see less of that mat, but it's still going to frame it nicely. Gives you a few more options. And I love the look of the splatters on the background. It just gives it a little bit of a different look to it, and it fills up that white space. For my third card, I'm using this stamp set, and it's a clear stamp set. I haven't used it before, and the one thing that I do first of all before doing anything with a clear stamp set is I use a white eraser on the stamping surface. It removes any manufacturing residue that might be on that stamp and makes sure that it can take ink really, really well. I'm using some distressed watercolor cardstock, mainly because I love how white and bright it is, and you're going to see the true colors of the colors that I'm going to be watercoloring with. And then I can position my stamp on here. I'm using my Misty stamping tool to help make sure that everything stays perfectly aligned. And because I'm using that Misty stamping tool, I can also stamp it multiple times just to make sure that I have complete images. The nice thing about the door of this is it also has those lines, so I can make sure that my sentiments are lined up straight with my paper. And I can stamp it multiple times with the Versamark ink to make sure I have a complete image. It's really hard to see the image that's being stamped while I'm stamping it, simply because it's clear ink on white cardstock. But once you have the powder on there, it's a lot more easy to see. And in person, you can kind of look to the side and see the shimmer of the ink on top of the paper. So it is easier that way to see the image. To make it even harder to see on video, I'm using some white embossing powder for this particular image, just for a little bit of a different look. You could emboss it with whatever color you want. So you could do black here, you could do a metallic, a silver or gold. You can do whatever color you want, but white on white creates its own unique and fun look to it. And those lines are going to show up as I'm doing my watercolor. So you will see the lines in the finished part, or the finished piece. For my watercoloring, I'm using some peeled paint as well as some bundled sage. So I'm starting with the bundled sage here. I'm using the full pads to do my watercoloring, but you could use the re-inkers as well, and I often do. I just wanted to make sure to show that if you have some dye-based ink pads, it's really easy to use them for watercoloring. I have a Zig water brush here that I'm using for my watercolor, mainly because the water is in the handle and it's very easy to use. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so if I were the type of person watercoloring with a jar of water, there's a very good chance I would spill it. That's just the way that I am. So by having a water brush like this with the water in the handle, it makes it a lot less messy for me. I have a piece of paper towel to my right. You can barely see it on screen there. And anytime I'm going to change colors, I will squeeze that brush onto my paper towel, or I can brush off any excess liquid that happens to pool there. I don't find that I have that problem often, but it is handy if you happen to have a brush that the water flows a little bit more to be able to blot it off on some paper towel. I'm starting with the outside lines with my leaves. You could easily start with the flowers if you wanted. And I'm starting with the light color first. And once I have a base of that lighter color, I will put in some of the darker peeled paint right close to where the leaves go below the flowers. So just like when I'm doing the stenciling and I'm heavier with that color right where a leaf goes below a flower where a natural shadow would be, I'm doing the same with my watercoloring. So I put the light color on first, and even with that light color, I start where I want that light color to be the darkest, because as I'm pulling that color out, there's going to be less color and more water, so it's going to create a natural shadow. And you can see as I'm doing my watercoloring that those white lines of the image are starting to show through, so you do see the details of the image. It just creates a unique look with that white there. And with that embossing with the raised edge, it just adds that extra little bit of detail. Now for this particular image, I didn't add any of the interference inks to the leaves, but I will add some to some of the flowers. So on my surface here, I've smushed my Kitsch Flamingo pad, and then I also smushed my Tropical Paradise pad. So the Tropical Paradise is the one that's the interference. So I'm putting that interference towards the base of the petal. It's a darker color than the Kitsch Flamingo, so it's going to add that natural shadow to it, and it's also going to have that shimmer from the interference inks. So we're going to get the best of both worlds. We're going to have the color, we're also going to have a little bit of that shimmer, giving you a little bit more of an interesting image with that floral. So I start with the lighter color with the Kitsch Flamingo and put it over the whole area, and then I go in with the darker with the interference and just put it anywhere I want that shadow. And because I go in right away with that interference right when that Kitsch Flamingo is still wet, it's going to naturally blend and bleed with each other. So it makes it really easy to do this watercoloring. Between each and every flower, I will go to my paper towel and I'll wipe that ink off. And you don't have to wipe it off completely, but I will wipe off that excess before going back in with that Kitsch Flamingo, so that I do have areas on the outside parts of those petals that are a little bit lighter. Because I have heat embossed this image, I don't have to worry about making sure an area is dry before I work on the next area close to it. I can immediately go and work on that area. That heat embossing adds that ridge, adds that barrier between the different areas, and it makes it a lot quicker and a lot easier to do that embossing. For my florals here being done, I wanted to add some color to my background, so I have that hickory smoke distress ink, and I'm just putting some shadow right around the edges of my flowers. I'm starting with my flowers and then I'm blending my way out so that that color goes naturally lighter because of that. And I'm also going to watercolor right over my sentiment so that that pops up. Without putting that paint there, or without putting the hickory smoke there, it would be a little bit harder to see that sentiment. So once I have blended it out, and originally when I had this in my mind, I wanted to just have that hickory smoke there. But as I was creating it, I felt that it needed something around the outside edges. So I do go back in and do some of that tropical paradise from the outside edges of my cardstock in. But I want to make sure that I have enough of that hickory smoke there before time. I'm also not waiting till that hickory smoke is completely dry. And by doing that, when my Tropical Paradise interference ink mixes or blends or gets to that hickory smoke ink, they're going to bleed together a little bit, creating a little bit of a blend between them. With the interference ink, even though I'm watercoloring with it, the shimmer is a little bit more subtle than when I'm stenciling right to something. I'm a little bit more heavy then, but you still see that shimmer where that ink is a little bit heavier. If when you're completely done, you don't have as much shimmer as you want, once it's completely dry, you can also take your ink blending brush, and you can add a little bit of ink blending around the edges to give it a little bit more of that shimmer. And I do that with this one. I'll trim it down first though. I want to make sure that it is 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And I'm using my guillotine trimmer here. I like to make sure when I'm doing this that that image is centered as much as possible, that I have an even space on the outside edges. And by doing my stamping and embossing on a piece that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, I have the freedom to do that once my piece is completely done. I can cut down any areas that I don't necessarily like, and then I will go in once it's completely trimmed and I will add any ink blending to those edges to make that Tropical Paradise color a little bit darker. And I'll be heavier around the outside edges and try to blend in lightly when I have less ink on my brush. I don't want any harsh lines. And with the Tropical Paradise or with the interference inks, often they're very juicy. So you do have to be careful when you're doing some ink blending with them if you want them to kind of blend into a lighter tone, because those ink pads are so juicy. For the mat for this card, I do have a piece of Lunar Gray cardstock here that I'm using. It's trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. So it's going to create a beautiful frame around my image piece here, and it's going to tie in with that hickory smoke shading around the florals. Here is the finished card, and you can see a little bit of the shimmer that you get from those interference inks around the outside edge and around the florals. Again, the videos never do it justice. Then we have the second card with the Better Press plate, using the stencils to color it, as well as that splatter background. And I love the interference inks on that as well, and that beautiful shimmer. Being able to use the same stencils as well as the same dies with both Better Press images as well as stamped images is brilliant and gives you a lot of versatility. And then we have that gorgeous first image with the Aura Glimmer foil, as well as our embossed Speckled Canopy background, and then the frame dies. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Have a fantastic day.